Welcome to Parasortium. Welcome to Parasortium. Today we are speaking with Dr. Callum Cooper. He is a parapsychologist who has been doing new research and experiments into the paranormal. Please join us for this informative chat on the weird. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. How are you
Good.
both?
Can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do, please?
Yeah, okay. I'm Dr. Cal Cooper. I'm an associate professor of psychology at the University of Northampton in the UK. I specialize in parapsychology, so looking at exceptional human experiences and abilities. And I also cover topics such as thanatology, which is death, dying, and bereavement, human sexual behavior, and positive psychology.
You're continuing the work of Raymond Bayless and Scott Rogo. Have you found that there's been any changes with the technology?
So what they were doing, Raymond Bayless in the 1950s was the pioneer of electronic voice phenomena. He was doing recordings in a soundproof studio in California with a professed medium called a televanzale. And they would set a recorder going in a soundproof box, and this was using reel to reel. And they'd sit in silence with the idea that a televanzale would send impressions to the magnetic tape. And upon playback, they get strange sounds, raps, scratches, voices, which Raymond wrote up as a letter to editor for the Journal of the American Society for Psychical Research in 1959. But parapsychology wasn't overly interested in this idea of electronic communication with the dead. But still, he carried on with this work. Other people became quite notorious for this, such as Friedrich Jurgensen. And people came forward to Raymond Bayless as he was mentoring D. Scott Rogo, who was very young at the time. He was 15, 16, and carried on kind of following in the footsteps of Raymond. And then by the mid 1970s, some people came forward and said, this might interest you. We've had instances, or I've seen instances, of people allegedly having phone calls from the dead or strange telephone calls that couldn't possibly take place between the living. Would you be interested? And they weren't. Initially, they weren't because they'd not heard of them. They'd not read about them. They're very scarce in the literature. But then more people came forward. So by 1979, they started a 2-year study of just this phenomena. And they found a number of instances. They ended up analyzing 50 strange cases, which became their book, Phone Calls from the Dead. So 30 years later, I stumbled across this as an undergraduate student. I owned the book, but I hadn't read it. I didn't realize that there was so little literature on it. So I picked up the book and read it avidly and started to make notes on all the statistics and the procedures and did some articles and papers on it, started collecting more cases for analysis, and it became the product of my own book, Telephone Calls from the Dead. And the one thing that was definite was Raymond had said by 1980 that as technology progresses, people will interact with it and naturally report something unusual that just doesn't fit the normal ways in which we use this technology. And unusual communication has come through, or the technology has behaved in an unusual manner, and people have attributed this to having a strange experience with it or a paranormal experience. So yeah, I mean, I think even now, I wrote that book over 10 years ago now, and iPhones and using iPhones for the internet or a satellite navigation when you're driving about, that was just becoming a new thing. People were more confident in using the iPhones. They were a lot slower then, but things, as you know, every year the technology gets better and better. So if I was to ask out again, people have asked, have you heard of FaceTime from the dead? Or, you know, an actual video communication? Or has there been something different with the more modern smartphones? I imagine there would be if I ask again and do a new survey right now. So yeah, it has advanced, and I think that's largely to do with people and their interpretation of the technology. But Raymond Bayless wasn't wrong in making that assumption.
That's see when people talk about the phone side of it, there's also our cars. The vehicles that we drive sometime register things that we don't physically see. Like we were on a trip in 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 Kentucky, and we were backing up, and the backup thing warned us that someone was there, and it did it 3 times, and there was no one there. We physically checked, and there was
Mm.
no one behind the car. Oh,
Yeah, it happens, and this is why ghost hunters have taken like motion sensors along that you would use for basic security and beam barriers, and is something that we cannot see going to pass through it and set it off. So again, you can see why people have put two and two together.
it's true. Um, you co-authored a book, Paracoustics, uh, that talks about sound and and the paranormal. Could you provide some insights on this topic, please?
Sure, that was Steve Parsons' baby in many ways because he's more in line with physics and looking at environmental psychology. And he was following in the footsteps of someone called Vic Tandy, who'd looked at infrasound, which is low frequency sound below 20 hertz. And it fluctuates like ripples of water in the bath. When you make a splash, it gets to the end and it comes back, and these sound waves just drift back and forth, so they fluctuate. And that was the process of his PhD. But he wanted to do a book that was an anthology. So we edited this book. It is not a read through. You don't go from chapter to chapter. You don't have to. You can just pick and choose what chapter you like. It's sort of a field investigation manual if you want to know something about sound. So there's things in there on the psychology of sound, the physics of sound, ghosts and spirits related to sounds. So the seance room through to hauntings, the history of electronic voice phenomena, the process of infrasound, the psychology of EVP, shamanic sounds and strange experiences, music and sound, spontaneous music. There's quite a few different chapters on all kinds of different things. And there's even an appendices of published papers relating to sound as well. So anyone that got hold of this book, you're using a field manual essentially. Steve did another book called Ghostology, which is a ghost hunter's manual. And then he did some more formal pieces that were for the Society for Psychical Research. So one is an investigator's handbook. It used to be called Notes for the Investigators of Spontaneous Cases. And he's also done one that's regarding electronic equipment, so EMF meters, digital thermometers, and so forth, and how they will be properly applied to monitoring the environment when you go to an alleged haunted location. So Paracoustics is a more digestible and fun version of that, really, where you will get an insightful history and you get a lot of references that you can follow up. And as I say, you pick and choose what chapter you like. It's not your standard book where you go cover to cover. It is meant for you to pick up what you need to read.
That's excellent. Um, Quite often, a lot of investigators, they don't have access to such comprehensive uh, books. They just jump in, and later they learn about such things. So knowing that exists is great.
And many have besides. I mean, this is the thing. The two things that have got people into researching hauntings and psychic abilities is one of two things. You either just read, get as many books as you can, and just read and digest the information. People before you, people that are acting with you, the detailed history of where we've gone from and to, or people go the academic route. They get their degrees, they work in the universities, they get research grants. Those are the only two processes. There's so many dodgy online qualifications and stuff, and people walking around that have called themselves doctors or parapsychologists when they're unrecognized. No one knows who they are. It's a Mickey Mouse paper mill certificate. There's no point. Just buy a book instead. Buy many books. You could get many books for the price it costs you to do something silly online. Just read or look out for recommendations. I always listen to recommendations on books. I love discovering something new that I thought I knew lots about, and then someone gives you another kind of, oh, I didn't know about that thing. And nothing's ever complete. We always strive for perfection, and that's great, but we'll never reach it. It never happens.
Do you believe outside forces such as tectonic strain theory, atmospheric conditions have an effect on phone calls and the paranormal?
I'm not so sure if they would have it on the phone calls, but certainly on a lot of anomalous experiences, we've seen that absolutely natural environmental changes can cause people to have unusual experiences. So the infrasound is one that we've mentioned. We know that electromagnetic fields can cause similar experiences. People get a sense of presence. They feel sick. Hairs stand up on the back of their arm or neck. We also know that geomagnetic activity, so essentially explosions on the surface of the sun, and the rays from that get sent to the earth, that influences people. We know moon phases influence people because they also affect electromagnetic fields. And weather changes as well. During electrical storms, people have reported instances of spontaneous psychokinesis or poltergeist-like activity. You might be similar to me. I certainly, when there's a severe weather change, a quick one, and all of a sudden we've got complete cloud cover and it's a gloomy sky and it's about to just produce a really big heavy rainfall, I get really bad pains behind my eyes, bad sinuses and stuff. And just, such a dull pain. So the weather is affecting your body. And if it's affecting your body, then it's also going to affect your psychology. And that could lead to misperceptions that people would attribute to something paranormal very fleetingly here and there. So absolutely, I'm completely of the agreement from the data that I've seen and the observations that the world that we live in and how it changes day to day, of course, is going to have an impact on us and our perceptions and what unusual experiences we may have.
It's true. It's true. We do some. We've been doing some experimentation with testing out areas where fault lines intersect,
Mm-hmm.
and we have a electromagnetic meter that we take with us, and so we have baseline reading. And one place, Mystic Vale, uh, we were walking through, and it went from 0 to uh, 0.8.
Yeah. So Mystic Vale's right on a fault line, and the interesting thing is the EMF was fleeting. So the light would go off, I would look at it and it'd go away, and then you'd walk like 100 yards, and it was like almost like as soon as you paid attention to it, it was gone.
You can get unusual spikes. I mean, I've been to some stone circles before, which are, of course, a long time ago were man-made for whatever reason that they put them there. But I've seen there be an electromagnetic impulse when you take a meter along between some of the stones. And sometimes people have reported a sudden spike in the middle of nowhere. Of course, these do happen. It's not necessarily anomalous. This is just EMF acting in its own way, certainly in a very sporadic way. We wouldn't normally expect it to happen in the middle of a field or in a forest or an open area. We'd expect to be near some sort of electrical system or a generator or something like that. But our main concern is to what extent do those spikes, depending on how often they occur, attribute to people in that location reporting that sense of presence or feeling sick and so forth. If it then goes all the way to someone seeing an apparition, well, that becomes harder to explain because we can explain some of it via those environmental factors, but the witnessing of an apparition that then talks to you or interacts in some way, that's going beyond what some of those environmental factors will contribute to. So they're interesting to document, and they're not unheard of when we get those unusual spikes. But we have to think, well, what have people really reported in this area? Is it all attributed to the EMF and the infrasound, or is something else going on?
Do you think telephones, and telegraphs were are a mere are mere archetypes that help us connect or communicate with people past or entities?
I think people reporting unusual experiences on them was an absolute fluke. That's, of course, not what we invented them for. Telegraph was very handy, especially for transatlantic travel. When you look at, you watch Titanic, and I'm sure you've seen at least one variation of that film.
Yeah.
That was really important. And it was mainly being used for iceberg warnings because they were crossing ice fields. All the ships were. It was a major problem. Sometimes when they were getting big ice fields, they'd just stop the ships and they'd just gently cruise along. They'd also get warnings from other ships if they were ahead or behind as to what was going on. But then passengers would pay for a wireless telegraph to be sent to their friends either side of the Atlantic, of how the weather is on board and what they're doing and business opportunities and whatever it is they're traveling from one place to the other to do. you could go to the wireless telegraph room to do that. And it's the quickest way to get that text message, essentially, as we would have now, to someone. But you've got people as early as David Wilson, who wrote a report in Light, which is the Journal of the College of Psychic Studies, founded in 1881. He was using the wireless telegraph and believed that the strange experiences he had, the strange messages, were coming from extraterrestrials. And that was back in 1915. Other people had reported what they believed to be spirits of the dead communicating over wireless telegraph, and then all the way through to the telephone as well. So people have reported additional voices on the line, but we've had that even when we had several landline phones in the house, and you could pick up the other phone and listen into a conversation, have three-way conversations, or the lines would get crossed with your neighbor, and you'd hear them slagging you off and saying bad things about what you've thrown into their garden or whatever else, or your garden's untidy, or what. You'd hear these additional things. You'd even have with early computers when you had like Windows 95 and it had external speakers. If you had them on and a car drove past your house and it got the radio on, sometimes your speakers would pick up what was on their car radio. We've got all these interesting flukes of technology that sometimes lead people to think they've had a strange experience or an additional voice has been talking to them. Some people believed, whether they were being truthful or not, like Thomas Edison speaking to Scientific American in 1920, that you could create these devices to be channels for the dead to get in contact if indeed they survived in some way. But these are people just presenting ideas. I'm not sure I'm of that ilk. I'm more interested in the psychology of people that have these experiences and to what extent is the evidence good that something new is going on rather than something we already know. But yeah, there have been people throughout time that believe that these were channels. Rogo and Bayless were in favor of the idea of survival and that some of these telephone calls were paranormal, and others were besides. So I'm at least aware of it, but I can't say I follow in their footsteps on that line of things.
Okay. When have you had any weird experiences while doing experiments?
Well, while doing experiments, we've had significant results. I was giving a lecture only yesterday to the students on remote viewing. And at the University of Northampton, we've done 4 major studies on remote viewing using a process called the Ganzfeld, which is from German, it means whole field, and it's inducing an altered state of consciousness. And in all 4 of those studies, they were successful. They were statistically significant. So it was in favor of the idea that the remote viewing process was actually working. People were gaining access to information at a distance. And I suppose also with the flotation tanks as well. I've been the participant for a lot of those, and I've come out and looked at the video clips that they're going to go off to an independent judge anyway to compare to what I've said. But some of them have been really striking in what I've seen in the tank and then seen on a video clip an hour later, and it's absolutely correct. And this is a target that's not selected until after I'm done. So the target itself doesn't exist until you're done. It's a future event. So we've even safeguarded the targets from people knowing about them by making the targets precognitive, which is interesting that you can safeguard your studies in parapsychology by making them a parapsychological thing in of themselves. You can't possibly know because it hasn't happened yet. And so that's a good safeguard in many ways. But that's a standard procedure, really.
That's it's mind-boggling that we've come to a point where we can do that and test it and have the accuracy. We've done one experiment with remote viewing with our group, and how many of us were involved in that? I think there was 30 of us.
Yeah.
And one person out of the 30 was able to get 100% of the predictions correct.
Well, that's good to know. So we will be doing that next week with our students. But Jessica Utz, the statistician and parapsychologist, said if you just take a group of people, only 1 in 100 people are naturally good at this anyway. So that's good that you found 1 in the 30. That's quite expected. That you've got a chance of maybe one of them. So that's good.
Yeah, yeah. But we found also that 5 and 8 could get at least 50%.
That's also good. I mean, are we talking like really accurate stuff, not mundane stuff that you could
Not
guess? Was it
mundane,
very specific?
very specific stuff.
Okay, well, that's
Uh,
good. You should do more of those, and if I could email you some of the procedure stuff that we use in the seminar, and you could try applying those. And
Wonderful.
we've got proper worksheets you could print off and have a go with your group. So
That'd be
see how
great.
that goes. It'd be nice to know if you do some more remote viewing practices.
All right. As a parapsychologist, what are your thoughts on well, we were just talking about Estes method, Michael Persinger's experiments, and that sort of thing.
I've heard of the Estes method, or what, it's not real. I
Mm,
mean, this has been made up for paranormal shows, and I've seen it on social media and stuff, and it really infuriates me that there's no such thing. Someone's put a name to it, I think, from where it was first done, or it's someone's name. It's the Gansfeld, and it's ghost hunters putting it in a haunted location.
yeah.
My opinion is it's unethical. I don't like seeing images of it. I don't like seeing footage of it. There's typically not a psychologist on hand to help out, or a psychotherapist. Ethics and risk assessment, I don't believe, have been typically done. There's no aim to what they're doing. There's no target in place or any judging procedure. It's just putting people in a very disorientated state without much understanding about the process of noise reduction model. It's made up. It's too many people seeing the Gansfeld in parapsychology and thinking, I'll have a go at that. I'll make it my own. I'll do this funny process with red light and shields and eye shields and headphones and put it in a haunted location. I've watched some of it. It's just aimless. And I just don't think it's very fair. As a psychologist, I don't see it very fair on the people doing it. I don't think people either appreciate the potential damages it could cause. But Michael Persinger, that's a completely different matter. Michael Persinger was applying things such as the God helmet, and he was using electrical stimulation to the prefrontal lobe, can create in the lab a sense of out-of-body experiences or experiences akin to alien abduction experiences. And people like Sue Blackmore were writing casual articles on this back in the early 90s for the New Scientist magazine. And it was a skeptic's way in to look at, well, if we stimulate the prefrontal lobe and people have these experiences, is that why people in the natural world have these experiences as well? Is this artificial stimulation the same as what people are reporting en masse regarding these experiences? It goes a long way, though, because it's suggesting that maybe there's a lot of people with undiagnosed temporal lobe epilepsy, which is a very big claim to make, and they're having it spontaneously or just a one-off. Whereas, you're essentially making this happen using the God helmet, which is what Michael Persinger was pushing with that. The Gansfeld doesn't stimulate your prefrontal lobe with electrical stimulation in any way. It just relaxes you with red lights over the eye shields and listening to static after you've gone through a relaxation procedure. And of course, the flotation tank takes that one step further. It instantly, without an induction, besides just music, some gentle music that fades out after 5 minutes, you're floating straight away. And you're naked in that tank. So you feel like you're having perinatal experiences. You feel like you're in a womb, you're being reborn. And it's just calming because the water is blood temperature. So you don't feel hot, you don't feel cold. So it's an instant floating away in an abyss of nothingness. So you're just left with your thoughts and hallucinations. So yeah, Estes method, it needs, in my opinion, to thoroughly go away. From what I see on social media anyway, it doesn't touch parapsychology. It's got nothing to do with parapsychology. There's no papers on it, thank goodness. It is just social media hype that I just think is very silly.
Okay. Neurologists and psychologists are working together to study the brain. How has this changed how we think and of our consciousness?
Well, consciousness is still a very complex topic. It wasn't even by the 1950s. You go to a standard textbook on psychology and you'd find very little about consciousness, which is surprising. It's everything that we are. The combination of our brain matter and these electrical impulses gives us this awareness for life, but mixed with all of our senses, our skin, our smell, our touch, our taste, our sound, our sight, all of those together give us this lived experience and memories of past and present, and our ability to have thoughts in our heads and to dream. Admittedly, there are some people that don't have those. Some people are colorblind. Some people can't hear. Some people are completely blind. Some people don't have mental imagery, which we call aphantasia, where you can't form a mental image. Our brains are all wired up slightly differently, but we know the extent to which a brain can work and what it's meant to do. But where consciousness comes from and where it goes is a massive quest in science to try and understand. It's very, very complex. Neurologists and cognitive psychologists, and consciousness study researchers, philosophers, they've got a big job on their hands. At least one of the big stepping stones that parapsychology has made in its time that it's been around, with very little funding and very little person power compared to westernized science, which has had billions of dollars pumped into it, and a lot of people working in those other domains of psychology, aside from parapsychology. Parapsychology is at least found through the Ganzfeld and psychedelic research and induction techniques that altered states of consciousness. So when you're, say, in a hypnagogic or a hypnopompic state, like you're left between going to sleep or just about to wake up, so like the Ganzfeld and others, when we place people in these states, it's psi-conducive, meaning that you're likely to either do well at a task for ESP, or you're going to have a strange experience. When we look at people's day-to-day accounts of strange experiences, and we look at the qualitative aspects, I was watching my favorite television program when all of a sudden I looked up and in the corner I was washing the pots and I had this strange feeling behind me. And as I looked, you're doing something boring, mundane, you're running an errand, you're driving the car, it's something very routine. If it's a skill that you're already good at, like driving a car. You can probably relate to being on autopilot sometimes when driving. You don't have to put much thought into it. You just know what you need to do and where to go. And when something jumps out, you automatically go back into, manual mode. It's mundane, it's boring, it's automated, but you're drifting off. You're in a state we call flow, and flow is it is an altered state. Time flies when you're in that kind of state, and so we know that altered states seem to be psych-conducive. Any further work that's being done, we know that again, temporal lobe epilepsy, when people are having those experiences, they report unusual visions and sometimes information that could relate to future events. Psychedelic research has done the same. There's been successful studies with that, where people have come out with accurate information about future events or targets. And so the latest work on parapsychology, and certainly where a lot more funding needs to go, is working with neuroscientists as well, and looking at brain regions during ESP tasks. And we've been talking about that for the last 20 years, but it's a big funding thing. And it's the person power as well. It's getting those people together. It's getting their time available. It's coming up with a task. It's getting the funding to do so. Parapsychologists had a few ideas and inklings about brain regions relating to certain kinds of phenomena. But I think that's where we are. We've done so many replications of the Ganzfeld, and there are loads of well-attested accounts of people having strange experiences. At Duke University alone in Durham, North Carolina, there's over 300 boxes of Louisa-Rhine spontaneous case reports that people sent in. It's over 10,000 accounts. Cambridge University have got a massive archive of people's experiences through the SPR, and many other places besides. So, yeah, neuroscientists, cognitive psychologists, they all need to be working with a parapsychologist. And in our group at Northampton alone, our research team for parapsychology is made up of parapsychologists, transpersonal psychologists, cognitive psychologists, consciousness study researchers, and neuroscientists. So everyone comes together to work on these disciplines.
That's wonderful. What is your expert opinion on when different paranormal events occur in one location? Example, hauntings, strange phone calls, where a Bigfoot is spotted in the woods, and possible fairy lights and UFOs.
All in one location.
Yeah. All in one location.
Again, I think we're best starting at getting those accounts of what people have said over time. Also, it'd be interesting to know whether these people have met or know of the prior experiences there. That would be compelling in of itself to start with. None of these people have met. None of them know about the history of the location. They've all gone here and they've all had these same experiences. Digging into the history records a bit would be very interesting as well. If someone's there all the time because it's a public building, a museum, a pub, something like that, could they keep a diary for you? as to every time it happens, what time, what day, what are the lighting conditions, who was there, what happened, and then go in. Then you can go in and finally do a bit of field investigation and take that environmental monitoring equipment, but see if it's needed, depending on what's been said in those diaries. Do you need to check for EMF? Does it sound like this structural vibration? So you might want to check for infrasound. Could it simply be something that's down to drafts, and you're checking the doors and the windows, and if everything's properly sealed when doors and windows are shut, or are significant drafts being let in at certain times? Raymond Bayless and Scott Smith, they went to investigate in his, I think it's listed in his book, The Enigma of the Poltergeist, a haunted train depot that was abandoned, and it had a ringing telephone, but there was no wiring in the building and there was no telephone. In fact, there was barely anything in this train station. And every time they went to where they could hear the telephone ringing, it then sounded like it was coming from the opposite wall. They go to the opposite wall, and then it sounded like it was coming from the middle of the room. They discovered, after a lot of back and forth and going to interview some distance over the road, a lumber yard, that they said, well, do you have a telephone? Yeah, we do. It's in the office. So if you're outside cutting wood and making planks and 2x4s and whatever, how do you know the telephone's ringing? They said, well, we've got an external bell on the office, so it rings. So if we're in the yard, we know in the office the telephone's ringing. They discovered that when the wind was in the right direction, on occasions when the telephone was ringing, the sound of that bell would get carried on the sound waves over to the train depot, and it was acting as an acoustic amplifier. And you could hear this ghostly ringing of a telephone that was coming from a number of yards away at a completely different building, only when the wind was in the right direction. If it wasn't blowing that way, you wouldn't hear it at all. So sometimes you've got to really think outside of the box of even the location itself in which people are reporting the experiences, and what they're experiencing in there is not from there. It's from something in the local vicinity as well. I was on an episode of Uncanny. It's a big podcast over here, but it's gone to Uncanny USA now through the BBC. You might have listened to it with Danny Robbins, and I did in Uncanny USA. So it's, I think it was series 4, season 4, episode 2. I did one called Dad's Phone, and it was about it was sort of a government phone that he had, this guy, and his family were hearing strange ghostly ringings on it and getting static when they picked it up. But I talked about thinking outside the box, because I mentioned a book called The Nature of Things by Lyle Watson, where he was talking about microwaves suddenly talking dirty to people, sexually explicit things, or chainsaws bursting into song, and things suddenly acting as radio transmitters, and when they shouldn't be. They're not designed for that, but because they were electrical, they were picking up on certain things. And so again, we have to really think outside the box of how this is occurring. So my idea would be that I'd say build on it. If someone's reporting things in a location, do a paper trail and build and wait. Don't rush into it. Look at all the possibilities and whether this is still happening, if it's consistent, and then go in. But that's your basis for a typical haunting. A haunting, by definition, are repeated experiences within a fixed location over a period of time. And when we look into that, you could have a number of people that have not met, that when they go to this location, they should be reporting similar things.
Our friends, they live in Kentucky, and they live in, it's the largest one of 2 largest geomagnetic anomalies in the earth. I think the other one's in Morocco. And they've been doing experiments testing the environment and entropy. And when they have weird things happen, their Raspberry Pi that measures the entropy flatlines for a long time.
Okay.
It
So what have they made of that?
they're so far they're coming from
Like a technomancy.
technomancy type side of things. Uh their their ideas are in we're living in a cybernetic system,
Okay.
and uh they're looking at second order cybernetics, that sort of thing, where
Mm-hmm.
uh our experiences and consciousness are part of a system,
Right. Okay.
which technically we all are.
We're
But
becoming more so like
very much
that.
so,
So,
yeah, yeah. And so they're doing all sorts of experiments. They created a sensor that takes all of this atmospheric data, measures on entropy and stuff like that. They've just finished building a prototype of the spear.
And they do different experiments. Like the last time they had this sphere, they went to a friend's house and they did a seance. And he had asked a question, and the entropy flatlined, I think, for like 2 or 3 minutes.
And they had all kinds of experiences in that. Um,
wow.
one thing we found in our own research is there's a buildup of phenomena that happens, and we've been calling it a phenomena bomb. It builds up and then blasts off, and you have a rash of experiences of various things, and then it calms down again. And that's
Hmm.
why we're testing the the local area for the tectonic strain uh, theory portion, is because it could be EMF building up, because where we live is an eggshell of fault lines, and it could just
Hmm.
be EMF building up from that is affecting the area and making people uh, feel and experience things.
No, that certainly sounds like it's got a lot of promise, that research. And I think there are certainly with locations, you get spikes where people are reporting a lot of things and then a long period of time where you don't. So, again, something environmental seems to be going on when that happens. The device that you're mentioning reminds me of, if you look up Alan Gould and Tony Cornell, they had a device that you might be familiar with called Spider. And it was one of the first kind of ghost hunting type piece of equipment where it involved a number of different things within it, such as atmospheric pressure, looking at temperature, and it was, they called it Spider because it's doing several different things, like a number of 8 legs sticking out. It's measuring several things at once, where they could just plonk it in a location and let it just run its thing. But people talked about that for a lot. They thought it was quite innovative for ghost hunting and these parapsychologists to create one device with several things going on at once. So you're not having to dash about with various pieces of equipment.
I find carrying all that equipment becomes cumbersome.
Yeah.
Having
And
one
it's
device.
mostly unnecessary. A lot of the time, it's very unnecessary. You just need to be gathering witness statements
Yeah,
and looking at, just critically thinking through the experiences and searching for conventional explanations. That the gadgets are just a massive distraction most of the time. Again, heightened by the media.
true. It's true. Um, I've found the best evidence we've got was from just sitting in a place quietly and finding what comes to us.
Just live with the building; it'll come to you. It did
Yeah,
for the people that reported it.
yeah. Is there anything you would like to discuss that we have not covered so far?
Uh, I think just be inquisitive, ask questions, don't accept everything at face value, explore books. If you're not sure what good books there are out there on things that interest you when it comes to paranormal phenomena, don't be afraid to reach out. There's loads of contact details for various authorities in the field and big organizations. There's in the US, there's the Parapsychology Foundation and the Parapsychological Association. In the UK, our biggest one is the Society for Psychical Research. In Australia, there's the Australian Institute for Parapsychological Research, or I think they've rebranded to Parapsychology Australia. You know, turn to people for the books. There are routes as well for education. And again, ask people that you already know working in the field, how do I get into this? Or if you're just wanting a bit of continued professional development, there's kind of things lesser than a degree you can get involved in that still immerse you with the authorities and the topic areas. Um, but I think for the ghost hunters, I would just say my advice is try not to get too enchanted with what you see in the media. I do a lot of the media, and there's a lot of stuff that I refuse to do because of their depiction of ghost hunting, like night vision, running about with the lights off. As you mentioned before, the Estes method, which I just think is complete nonsense. For example, I had a ghost hunter email me probably a year ago, and I mentioned it on my social media because it was just so deluded and funny at the same time. But they said, "What's the best night vision camera you can recommend?" And it's not my area. I'm not really the technology guy, but I said, "What's it for?" And they said, "Oh, there's a haunted pub. I want to go and investigate, and I just wanted some good cameras for it." And I said, "But what do you need the night vision for? That will kind of help me with the answer." And they said, "Well, at 3 in the afternoon, 3 to 4 in the afternoon, people have reported things moving around in the bar area." And I said, "Well, 3 to 4 in the afternoon is going to be daylight conditions. So what do you need the night vision for?" And they said, "For an investigation. So we're going to go there at night." And I said, "Why? You're going to go and investigate in the very conditions people haven't reported anything. If you had the police around because of a break-in or repeated break-ins and they were happening at 3 or 4 in the afternoon, the police would not have a stakeout at 3 or 4 in the morning because that's not when it's happening. If you're saying consistently it's happening in the afternoon, then wait around that time. Don't go at another time and do something completely different. It doesn't make any sense. Follow the witness trail, follow the evidence and observations, and that should help you with your own investigations. Don't do something because the TV has shown you about night visions and this idea that ghosts come out at night. Not really. Follow the witness account. That's your lead.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's my advice to ghost hunters and ghost hunting. If you are using gadgets, there are good books out there. Look at Steve Parsons, look at his recent manuals through the Society for Psychical Research, or at the very least, check out his book Ghostology. Paracoustics is just a complement to that, and we're steadily working on Paravision. That should be out next year. Everything about sight and vision and the paranormal. So that should be out next year. And Rogo and Bayless, their original book, Phone Calls from the Dead, I've had to hand type that back out. That will be out in a few more months, so it's out of print. The old version is very expensive if you can find it. There'll be an easily accessible version in a few more months, and I've written a postscript to it, so I've extended where we are now in the last part of the book. So the original book has some writing by me at the end, so there's a new chapter. So that will be back out.
You're gonna make a lot of people very happy.
Good. It's taken ages, and it was more so getting the rights because Raymond Bayless did not have any family. So we had to chase back through the original publishers and what they wanted to do with it, if anything. So there's that. And besides that, if anyone wants to know what I'm doing, what I'm up to, just follow me on X, which was Twitter, Callum E. Cooper. And my website is callumecooper.com. And you can see the latest talks that I'm doing, or if I'm doing any webinars and things like that.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for coming on with us.
Yeah, thank you. It was great.
You're welcome. It's good to meet you both.